Chapter 14 Crossroads. Xingjin was crouching by the small fire, rousing sleepy flames awake from the embers still slumbering under the white ashes, ready to warm the morning tea. He stood up and straightened, tilting his head at the sound of his hurried steps approaching. "Zijin, have you seen—" Too excited to wait for the sentence to be finished, he reached out and took the rising hand in his own and dropped the coin into it, knowing a white-hot moment of terror and hope mingled into one. "Xingjin!" Xingjin started so violently he almost dropped the coin, and Songlan quickly captured his hand again, gently folded his fingers down more firmly around the treasure he held. "Zijin? You can hear me?" "Yes, Zijin! Oh, Zijin, your voice! I can— How? What is this?" "The coin. It's a talisman for speaking with the dead. As long as you have this, you can hear me. Shuyang gave it to me." Not having to painstakingly trace out every single sign stroke by stroke, thinking through every sentence 3 times over beforehand, pick out the simplest possible words, his vision went somewhat blurred again, but not with darkness. "Shuyang gave? Why?" Which was a very valid question, and one he'd certainly want to dig deeper at, but not at all the focus he wanted for the first conversation since parting ways at the mountain, endless years ago. "Xingjin," he said again, only that treasured name, forcing what remained of his tongue to speak the syllables as clearly as he could make them, could say nothing but that name forever and still be content. Xingjin's whole face was brightening into a wide smile, and it was like watching the sunrise illuminate the world after a long, overcast morning, every part of him lighting up, though his lips were trembling. As though he'd be content hearing nothing but that name from his mouth forever. "Zijin!" "I looked for you," he interrupted, because his words had been dammed up for so long, allowed out only in the very faintest trickle, and there were so many of them waiting to surge out, he felt he could burst if he tried to hold them back any longer. "I looked all over the world for you, ever since we parted ways. Xingjin, I'm so sorry for the things I said. I'm so sorry. Not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted it, and I searched the world for you, to find you, to tell you, to ask for your forgiveness." Xingjin's smile wavered, and suddenly he looked like he might start crying, though a last vestige clung to the corners of his mouth, as if his joy would never truly fade again. Zijin, no, you don't need to. I was the one who— It was my fault. I'm so sorry for everything you lost, what I did. In Yi City, I killed you." Songlan squeezed his fingers so hard around Xingjin's hand holding the coin that their hands both shook with it, forced himself to ease his grip so as not to accidentally hurt him. "It wasn't your fault, none of it was. I have many regrets, but never you, never anything to do with you. Only for hurting you, for saying those things, for leaving you. If I hadn't—" There were faint blotches of red appearing on the blindfold, and he helplessly yearned to reach out to wipe them, magically make them go away, but didn't know if the touch would be unwelcome, if it would hurt. "You're here now," Xingjin whispered, as though still marveling at something miraculous. "We're here now, no more regrets." Apparently he was crying himself now too, Songlan realized, Xingjin's defined features going blurred, an ache in his chest that wasn't bitter resentment. No more regrets. Xingjin laughed, this new Xingjin who took so easily to smiles and laughter, despite all the pain he'd gone through. "Oh, Zijin." Speaking with that impossible softness, he slowly raised the hand holding the coin, his own grasping hand rising along with it. "Is it wrong?" Xingjin asked, so quietly, turning his face down as though to look at their clasping hands. "Is it wrong that I will miss this?" It took his breath away, made him need to breathe, yet finding himself breathless. "We don't have to stop, not if we don't want to." Suddenly shaking, weak, he turned their hands so that his own could raise them both even higher, raised them to his face to brush at Xingzhen's bared wrist with his lips. More terrified than he could remember feeling since before the darkness, maybe ever. Would rather stare down death a second time than the thought of Xingzhen pulling away now. But he just gave the softest gasp, his fingers twitching once. Zizhen. Barely a breath, and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry with it, the fondness of it. Maybe he come apart with all the emotions it lit up inside himself, bright ones, smothering bewildered resentment and forcing it back somewhere so deep down he could barely feel it there at all. Almost, so very nearly, alive. Then Xingzhen leaned in toward him, and for a moment of nearly going sightless himself with surprise, apprehension, anticipation, he believed he would kiss him. But instead he leaned their foreheads together, and somehow that was something closer still. "Stay with me," Xingzhen whispered. "Please, don't ever leave me again." And talisman or no, he found himself without words, unable to speak after all. Just lifted his other hand to wrap the hand in his grasp tighter, felt Xingzhen do the same with his free hand, his slender fingers wrapping around his, tangled together like the strings of fate that bound them into one. Xu Yang never felt regret. It was one of those things he'd been informed on occasion by some very few very brave people that you should feel. Regret at having made mistakes, caused hurt, made a glorious mess out of things. The last regret he could remember feeling was helpless fury at having allowed himself to be used, a trusting stupid little fool, and broken. The fury he'd held onto, the regret he scrubbed away, scoured out of bleeding flesh with steel and salt and vinegar, and never let back in. Xiao Xingzhen didn't count. The memory of him falling lifeless to the ground, Shuanghua clanging like the bronze bells of war and death rituals. That wasn't regret, was something far greater and harder to define, a strangling lead weight settled in his lungs, his bones, his flesh, his blood, every last particle of him. If you cut his hair, you could probably see that feeling oozing out of it, but he didn't know what name to put to it. Never liked thinking too much about it. He felt intense regret now. Watching the two Dao Shi, it gnawed at him, sizzling under his skin, itching until he wanted to claw it out with his nails. Having given away such a precious bargaining chip for free, given it at all. What a noble thing. To have allowed them this, to so graciously have hammered the Songlan-shaped wedge even more firmly between himself and Xiao Xingzhen. Xiao Xingzhen, who was happy. He could see the radiant smile all the way from here, shivered with it, remembering what it felt like to see it up close. Tasted bile, would have given anything to stand where Songlan was standing. That smile meant for him. There had been a hole in Xiao Xingzhen's world after Baishu, ripped out of him to cause hurt. A dug-out trap he'd somehow, ironically, stupidly fallen into himself. A vacant space in Xiao Xingzhen's life for him to occupy for a while, knowing that smile, that endless tenderness. He could see the gap close between them now, see it happen, himself forced out like unwanted water from near-drowned lungs. It hurt. He wanted desperately to hate them both, loathe them, rip them apart for the pain they caused by just standing there together, craved that soothing hatred. Songlan was easy. He'd hated him since he first saw him, that cold, aloof face, judgmental. Hating Xiao Xingzhen had been easy once, half a lifetime ago. Now, even trying just made him remember a pale, dead face, the thought of it making him nauseous. He closed his eyes, refused to watch anymore, sat down with crossed legs at the edge of the rock pool, settling back to calm his rough breathing, attempting and failing to find some sort of inner balance, replenish his exhausted qi enough to carry him through another agonizing day of walking. If the two Dao Shi would tear themselves away from each other long enough to get back on the road at all. Seeming less and less likely the more endless time that passed. There was no inner peace to be found, but keeping his eyes closed was better than seeing, having to watch the one thing that still mattered getting torn into smaller and smaller pieces, discarded and scattered to the wind like ash. Over the waterfalls and his own turmoil, he didn't hear Xiao Xingjin approach until he was all the way up close, so damnably light on his feet when he wanted, walking as on clouds. One of the few capable of sneaking up on him without even meaning to. Eyes snapping open, he felt himself tense, every fiber of him drawn taut, like bracing before a striking blade. An enemy with a sword he could handle, could laugh easily even as the stroke fell. But Xiao Xingjin, capable of dealing such merciless hurt or tender euphoria at a whim, he wasn't sure he wanted him to speak at all. Hesitating in front of him only for a moment, Xiao Xingjin opted to sit down on the rocks beside him, at arm's length distance, but it was still better than being stared down by that unreadable, eyeless gaze head-on, as though on trial. "You're meditating?" He allowed himself to relax somewhat at a soft tone, though not letting the coiled tension dissipate completely, still ready for fight or flight. "Of course," he said lightly. "A wise Dao Shi master must keep up his daily spiritual routine, don't you know that?" Xiao Xingjin smiled, not the full radiance, but still one of those small quirks at the corners of his mouth, a single ray of light from between the clouds, and it was enough, his whole being leaning into it like some sorry little struggling weed reaching desperately for the sunlight. "You really shouldn't," Xiao Xingjin gently chided, but sounded more amused than offended. He allowed himself to relax a little further. "I'm taking an interest in philosophies. Is that so bad? You should be flattered." He had hoped for another of those small smiles, but Xiao Xingjin only looked thoughtful, just a little wary. "You were never very interested in the teachings before." "It's been over 7 years. I was bored. Had to find ways to fill my time somehow." Trying to figure out what could possibly make someone capable of thinking, acting the way you do, he thought. "Dusty old scrolls, the closest thing I could come to hearing your voice again, just for a moment." And, of course, memorizing the scriptures had been useful for keeping up appearances, playing out a part. But that was a fact best buried deep, best left buried forever. Finding out about certain things done in his name would undoubtedly make Xiao Xingjin very upset. Best he never did. "I'll be happy to discuss philosophy with you," Xiao Xingjin said, which sounded more like a threat than a promise, to be honest, the prospect only made bearable by the thought of Xiao Xingjin's voice reciting the convoluted words. "But please don't act as a master again. It's not appropriate." He scoffed, hard enough that a jerk made his shoulder protest. Fine. It was just a joke. I won't," he added before Xiao Xingjin could speak the reproach he could see coming. "Won't do to make Song Daozhang so upset." Neatly checking the very top line of his subjects best left alone list again. He swore internally. Xiao Xingjin lowered his head, as though looking down at his hands in his lap. "The speech talisman." He tensed again, bracing. "It's harmless," he forestalled, trying to anticipate the angle of any blow coming. "It can't hurt him, just a piece of superstition enhanced by crafty tricks. The only demonic cultivation on it is the sigil for letting his own dark energies fool the spell, that's all." Xiao Xingjin raised his head again, face turned toward him, and he would never know just how that blindfolded, hollowed gaze could pin him so helplessly to the spot, as though it saw everything. He knew it didn't. It hadn't seen the truth for 3 years. "Why?" Xiao Xingjin asked. His voice was as unreadable as his face. A question undefined enough to leave a million ways out. Feigned ignorance, sarcasm, ruthless counterattack. A dangerous question, asking it the day before had hurt him. For once, he didn't know what to say. "I was curious, wanted to see if it worked," he muttered, rolling his eyes out of habit, though it couldn't be seen, stalling. Xiao Xingjin just listened, head cocked, patient. as though there was no way in the world he wouldn't eventually receive an honest, rational answer. Wouldn't those be nice? I thought it would make you happy, he finally snapped out, accusing, attacking. Why? Are you upset? Because the rules seem to change every few hours. Formerly appreciated jokes taken as insults, and every other attempt at making things better so far had ended with Xiaoxingzhen broken, offering him his vengeance, bringing his hand to his heart to feel the reborn flow of Qi, even just answering his questions. Thankfully, he didn't look distraught now, only surprised. He lowered his head again, pressing his lips slightly together the way he would when lost in deep thought. Xu looked at him, looked and looked, drank in the way he glowed in the bright morning light, moving, breathing, alive. Of course, Xiaoxingzhen finally said, deliberately, as though carefully choosing his words, I am still upset about many things. Xu gave a cynical half-laugh at that. I know that. Broken things weren't that easily fixed. Most broken things couldn't ever be made truly whole again. He had the crushed fingers to prove it. But not this, he pushed, picking at the sore spot, needing to know if he'd finally gotten it right. This was a good thing? If anything, Xiaoxingzhen only looked more surprised. Yes, of course. This, to be able to speak with him again. It means everything. Thank you. And then he did smile at him, a real smile, and if it wasn't endlessly affectionate as it once had been, at least it was genuinely happy, and he could have wept at the sight. He smiled back, devastated with it, allowed himself a terrifying, vulnerable moment of being soft. You're welcome. Perhaps being stale water forced out of finally breathing lungs wasn't so bad, if it meant a chance to brush past those gentle lips one more time. Xiaoxingzhen couldn't stop smiling. Walking down the road, he was caught in the crossfire of a vehement discussion, Zijin and Xu passionately arguing Taoist philosophical conundrums, and the absolute absurdity of it made him want to burst into laughter. He failed to hold it back at times, instantly making them both try to sway him into taking sides, which he would absolutely not. Xu every bit the same as Cheng Mei would have, switched opinions without a moment's notice, very little interested in the actual standpoint, very much interested in winning, at any cost, abandoning previous arguments 3 times in a single breath. A roundabout, disjointed way of arguing Zijin hadn't quite caught onto yet. Zijin, who on the other hand was far more versed in both the subject matters and ways of debate, a steady, patient approach quite clearly driving Xu insane. The way he patiently kept circling back and building an ever stronger case for his point of view. So, putting a year's worth of effort into growing ridiculously huge gourds, the man's upset that he actually grew ridiculously huge gourds? It's an allegory. And because they were too big, he couldn't use them for hauling water, so the idiot just smashed them and let them rot. Because he lacked imagination. He couldn't envision using them beyond the intended purpose. He could have used them for something else, Zhuangzi argues, like a small craft to sail down the river and see new sights. But that's even more stupid. Boats are already a thing, they exist. This is how you can tell these things were written by rich, well-fed assholes, managing to grow food the size of a boat only to smash it. Idiots. It's not supposed to be taken literally. The moral lesson of the story is to see more solutions than the obvious, adapting as circumstances change. And these are the shoulder-patting moral lessons the self-righteous Dao Shi tell each other while pretending to make the world a better place? Building boats out of food for a pleasure cruise down the river? Then I guess you're all idiots too. I think, Xiaoxingzhen interrupted, diplomatically staving off a more serious argument, that we should get something to eat. We're coming up on a village, aren't we? I can hear a large crowd. They had come across more and more other travelers over the few last hours, the road busy enough that they had chosen to walk to one side to let others pass them by, still keeping a rather slow pace. "There's a small town at the crossroads just up ahead, 2-story houses with red-tilted roofs along the stream," Xiang replied, automatically falling back into the habit of describing things for him. "A backwater little place, but there's enough people coming through here that they have a pretty big marketplace. We can stop for food there." "Zhejian?" "Yes." A concise agreement, neither more or less. He couldn't help but smile despite himself, remembering all the clashes on philosophical viewpoints they had had over the years, albeit outright calling the other idiot somewhat less often, at least in so many words. Entering the small town, it still took some time for his senses to adjust to the amount of people, the noise and scents and bustle, for a moment overwhelming. But he could smell food and realized he really was hungry. "Let's find something to eat and then sit down for a while. There are market stalls along the right side of the road." He nodded, letting the other two lead the way. For a moment the smells of fresh produce and the sound of hawkers advertising their wares was something so familiar that he could all but feel a woven basket in his hand, getting ready for the daily argument about what food to have for dinner and whose turn it was to get it. There was a familiar laugh, and Xu Yang leaned in, apparently thinking the same thing. "A whole stall selling coriander, Dao Zhang. Enough to poison my meals for a month. Sure you don't want to get some?" He couldn't help but smile. That had been a constant argument. He and Ah Ching had loved the fragrant greens. Cheng Mei adamantly had not. Had still always bought some when it was his turn to get groceries, though, while grumbling grandly about his self-sacrifice and demanding it be left out of his food to be added to theirs separately. "If you keep calling the followers of my sacred teachings idiots, maybe I will." Another laugh at that, delighted. "Ah, no doubt, Zhang. Don't be so cruel. You should just get soap instead. It tastes the same, but at least you can use that to wash things." He found himself laughing again, allowing himself to remain in the memories for a few moments more. Beautiful lies. But who said you couldn't allow yourself to suffer a lie for a short while if it was beautiful? "Come!" Suddenly there was a gloved hand on his, just a bit too forceful in its enthusiasm as always. "Over here! They sell flowers! You love to smell the flowers, don't you?" "Oh!" he exclaimed in surprise, stumbling, unprepared for being yanked ahead so unexpectedly, and immediately the hand let go of his as though burned, allowing himself to regain his balance, physically, though his mind was still reeling. "I'm sorry, I forgot." Xiang's voice came from a few paces away, as though he'd instantly stepped away, sounding apprehensive. "It's fine," he assured, drawing a few deep breaths. "But don't—" I know, I forgot." He sounded upset, angry with himself for the misstep, which meant prone to lashing out at everything and everyone else without warning. The worst part was, he had forgotten too, for several moments, forgotten what was so bad about that touch, the warmth and familiarity. Zhijian's presence stepping up, resting a hand at his other elbow was a blessing, grounding him in the present, the real world. Dissipating lies, no matter how deceptively beautiful. "Are you all right?" He smiled weakly. "Yes, I just stumbled. It's fine. Let's look at the flowers and then eat?" The mood was notably more subdued as they walked over to the vendor selling flowers, though the sweet scent did help lift his spirits. "Will you describe them to me?" he turned and asked, a peace offering, because that was a game they'd played before, seemingly harmless enough. "Lilies," Xiang replied, after only a moment's hesitation. "They are poison, you know, worse than even your awful coriander." He couldn't help but smile. "Yellow flowers that look like Wen sun emblems, with hundreds of little petals like flames. They don't smell like much. Peonies like the snowy ones in Jinlingtai, but the color of still beating hearts." Pink lotus buds, they smell sweet. Big white ones that look like fireworks if you caught them out of the sky and put them on stems. Chrysanthemums, Sitchin supplied, voice as cool as his lingering touch was gentle. A symbol of longevity or death. Not the symbol I'm familiar with, Shuyang snarled, clearly angry at the interruption. On the streets it means... Maybe we should just get that food, Xiao Xingjin hurriedly interrupted before things could get even more out of hand, turning away, no doubt to the vendor's disappointment. I'm hungry. I think a meal would do us all good. Fortunately, it seemed they could agree on that at least. He let Sitchin's gentle touch guide him past the produce stands toward the stalls selling cooked food, forcing himself to focus enough to at least nod vaguely in response when asked what he'd like to eat, trying not to remember the shape of a half-gloved hand in his and how it had seemed to fit so naturally there for a breathless moment before the world rushed back in. He could see it, suddenly, see what instilled all those smiles and laughs Xingjin lit up with so often these days. It was terrifying. Not his joy. That he would always treasure. But how easily he would lower his guard once made to smile. As though he hadn't been hurt enough, hadn't trusted enough and been broken with it. Song Lan's angry apprehension woke the slumbering resentment up again as he trailed along beside Xingjin, raising its head like a serpent, flicking tongue to smell prey. The other two paused at a vegetable stand, laughing at some mundane thing or other, a baffling, momentary return of disturbing familiarity that he wasn't a part of, didn't even understand. Are you keeping up, little? Xiang turned to laugh, gaze aimed too low, as though he had briefly expected someone else there. His smile faltered for an imperceptible moment as he quickly looked up, then the teasing expression turned cruel and mocking. He sharply turned back ahead, dragging Xingjin along to look at flowers. Even after the base murderer grabbed so possessively at his hand, unwanted and uninvited, Xingjin still smiled, though it was more forced now, and at least he kept a more wary distance. It had been a while since Song Lan allowed himself the satisfyingly detailed visions, but he suddenly yearned fiercely once more to squeeze that throat, wring that neck, make sure Xuyang would never get past Xingjin's easily breached defenses and hurt him again, hurt anyone ever again. He still itched with it by the time they found an outcrop at the edge of the village, overlooking the river, settling down to eat. It took a few deep, meditative breaths to calm himself, sitting down at Xingjin's side. He deserved better company than an angry corpse reeking of resentment, he told himself. Where do you want to go from here? He asked, and Xingjin thoughtfully tilted his head in his direction. We are at a crossroad. We need to make a decision. Could we just keep going the way we have? Xingjin replied, and it was easy to think they were really only speaking of directions. East, since we've been heading that way. There's little for us back west. Can't go into Yunmeng, Xuyang stated, unasked, habitually attacking his meal like he was trying to murder it. The creative things they do to demonic cultivators in Yunmeng give me nightmares. We're not demonic cultivators, Song Lan coolly pointed out. Xuyang flashed his teeth at him. I am, and you're a walking corpse. And he's kept alive by a spellwork of demonic cultivation settled under his skin. The good people of Yunmeng would burn us alive. Xingjin looked uncomfortable, moving restlessly, as though the mention of the spellwork branded into him suddenly itched. We should go north from here, Xuyang continued hastily, perhaps trying to distract him before popping another morsel into his mouth. Only direction that makes sense. North will take us to Yiling, Song Lan argued. Past the burial mounds. We shouldn't go there. Why not? Xiang smirked at him. The fierce corpse afraid of ghosts? You said it yourself, he reminded, gaze steady, recalling a conversation in a dark little shack, and some of the truth laid bare there. Being near death and the dead, it would not be safe for a newly resurrected soul. The mocking smile slid off Xuyang's face, and he lowered his chopsticks with a frown, which meant he was right, but Xingjin slumped yet a little more. Northwest, then? He suggested, no doubt aiming to sound light-hearted, succeeding as poorly as ever when he attempted anything even close to dishonesty. Shi Yang scowled deeper. Northwest means backtracking west almost all the way we've come. That makes no sense. We'll need to cross the river at some point anyway if we can't go further east. I suppose, Xingjin agreed, while Xu Yang's ever-darkening scowl took on a downright petulant pout. We could go literally any other way, cut across Yiling beyond the burial mounds, or skirt around the edges of Yunming where there's no people. We already concluded that would be an unnecessary risk. There's no reason we can't just head northwest, is there? It was easy enough to imagine Xu Yang causing trouble and making enemies everywhere. Hard to imagine that one particular place would be worse than any other. It's boring, he just hissed in response, without going into further explanation. The most boring place in the world. Boring isn't a reason. We came here on the western road. If we can't go east to Yunming or north through Yiling, northwest is the only road left. Xingjin nodded slowly. I never thought, he said, half lost in thought, that there would be so many places in the world I wouldn't be able to go now. Give it time, he said gently. Perhaps once his soul had healed and grown stronger, and they had gained a sense of the winds currently blowing in the cultivation world, just the two of them. There's no rush for anything. We'll see where the future carries us. Xingjin gave him a small smile, but there were still shadows of doubt lingering on his face. Xu Yang just sulked in silence, stabbing repeatedly at the last piece of carrot in his stew with a chopstick before sullenly scooping the resulting mush into his mouth. Once they had finished resting, they made their way back through the small village, picking up a few supplies before heading on, wanting to get in a few more hours on the road before dark. And at the crossroads, they took the road leading northwest to Kuizhou. Blooper. Fresh produce and produce. Chrysanthemums. What the fuck? Chrysanthemums. 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 Chrysanthemums, Tijin supplied. For a breath,